I'm Tom Gorin. I can, quick intro. I'm French originally. I've been in the US now for more than half my life, so multicultural by now. My background is pretty heavy across what I would say three dimensions. It's around pricing, it's around data science, and it's about revenue optimization. So those are kind of the three things that I see as defining my career and that led me to where I am today. And so, if I think about what that looks like throughout my career, I started in the airline industry, which was an amazing learning opportunity about dynamic pricing, about thinking about companies that are what I would say at the forefront of pricing. It's a very different pricing business than any other company in the world, but they're really leading the charge in personalized solutions, et cetera. Then I went on to join Pros, where I am today. And there I shifted a little bit to the B2B side of the pricing equation. And so, airlines focus heavily on revenue optimization through pricing. On the B2B side, it's a bit more focused on a range of sales effectiveness, optimizing the entire sales experience with a focus on pricing, and got to learn a tremendous amount at Pros. And then the data science piece to me is sort of what brings it all together. It's how you can really bring out the power of pricing through leveraging algorithms and improving what you're doing on a day-to-day basis. So that's about me in a nutshell. I can try. I think pricing transformation to me is part of what I would call the digital transformation or a more global transformation of your company. When I think of pricing as a rule, like looking at it a little bit in phases, historically pricing, I would say, at least on the B2B side, has taken a bit of a back role, back office kind of function. It's sort of historically been a little bit secondary to sales. Like sales is important. You really want to create the relationships with your customers. You want to understand what they're looking for and then execute on your strategy. And pricing is one component of that. So that's sort of how I see things of having started for, kind of the pricing function. And then you start to move forward a little bit and you see that pricing, in fact, is a critical component of your day-to-day strategy. That's what people think about. If I equate that to the way we travel, right? I mentioned I have a strong background in the airline business. Well, when we're traveling for leisure, there are some exceptions, but a lot of people tend to look for the best possible deal. And if you think about how you're thinking about your day-to-day relationship, getting a good deal is very important. It's not the only component, but it is very important. So back to your original question here on what's a pricing transformation. Well, pricing transformation to me is about moving the pricing function from a back office function to a much more front and center function that takes into consideration all the components of your deal, your relationship with your customer, and recommend the right solution to your customer. And that happens through multiple layers of complexity. And, I try to simplify it a little bit by looking at three dimensions. One is at the lowest level, I would say, is kind of your modeling. How are you going to model your pricing? What do you need to do for your pricing in that specific relationship in this industry? What are the components that are important and how can you do it? The second piece is execution. How do you execute on your pricing? And so it's all around who are my salespeople, who are my customers, how do they think about their products, how do I deliver that experience to them in the best possible way? And the third piece, which is also pretty critical, is infrastructure. Because if you don't have any data, if you don't have any infrastructure to collect that data, you're not going to be able to execute or build models. So you really need that infrastructure. And it's a really core piece of your pricing experience and de facto of your pricing transformation. So it's interesting. So I wouldn't necessarily talk about the past of pricing transformation, maybe more so the past of pricing, right? And so if you think about pricing again as that back office function, what what really ended up happening is a lot of pricing was done on a gut feel. So you have, if we think and focus on the B2B side of the house, you have salespeople that have a tremendous amount of knowledge. They know their products, they know their customers, and they have those relationships. And so they're pricing on the basis of those relationships, and they build those relationships over long periods of time. And so that knowledge really drives and creates their strategy. And so they are used to pricing on the basis of what they've seen historically. The challenge, though, with that approach is that they don't necessarily have a complete picture of what's going on outside of their business and how they've been managing that business. And so if you think about it, I'm not suggesting that sales teams weren't doing a great job in the past, but they didn't have all that information that we have at our fingertips today. Like, who are our competitors? What are some of the market forces that are driving pricing? What pressure do I have on my side, for example, in terms of what supply is available, and how should that affect my pricing? And so you come from a situation in the past that's heavily relationship driven, and dare I say, a little bit lacking on information. So that's one dimension. Another dimension is that historically, those types of pricing deals, which could be very complex and very large deals, would take a long time to turn around. So imagine, you're in that pricing relationship. You're, I don't know, a large company reaching out to a distributor. You need to fulfill your office supplies for the next year or so, and you've got 1,000 line items of things, products that you're buying for your huge warehouse, and that would take potentially days to weeks to turn this deal around. And so that the speed of interaction could be very slow. So that's kind of where we started, right? This is the past of pricing. It's a heavily relationship driven, limited data availability and slow process. And that leads to challenges like, obviously slow responses to bids, potential revenue leakage because you don't know exactly where you could be driving on price. And also ultimately on long deals where you have thousands of line items, you don't have time to actually review every single line item to provide the optimal price point for each of those line items. So you're going to focus on the big ticket items or those items that your customers has strong emphasis on. And then you have a long tail of products at the end of that deal that are potentially getting overlooked and where you could conceivably make more margin. As we were setting up for this conversation, I was thinking a little bit about what I could say about the current situation. And obviously being, hopefully on the tail end of COVID for us in the US and hopefully around the world, we're in an interesting situation where if you had asked me the same question about a year ago, I would have told you that the current situation of pricing is evolving, it's changing. We're seeing more and more companies moving towards much faster interactions, more data, better integration. But now that we've been in that COVID situation, we've really forced the transformation. And it's been difficult on some companies, and it's been, easier on some others. Obviously Amazon comes to mind, right? They already had that infrastructure to have those very fast relationships with their customers now. Admittedly, it's more retail and B2C than it is B2B. But the fact is that they had set up their environments to be very responsive in an e-commerce situation. Well, about a year ago, I would have told you the current situation is a slow transition to self-service, to having much better information, to creating guidance for your pricing, to really taking that function to the forefront. And that's a lot of what we do at Pros, right? We offer pricing solutions that help our customers move from that negotiated, slow relationship to a much faster turnaround where you get guidance, you have information, we're recommending pricing, we're giving the salespeople this price envelope that is where they should strive to get their price into. but it's based on science, it's based on information, and it's providing supporting information to the salespeople to help them have the conversation with their customers and help them understand where the pricing recommendation is coming from. So that's where we were. Now you fast forward a year, and we've now moved into this environment, which is really exciting, where we're self-service, right? So much more. Like the more and more of the pricing discussions now happen online. You're self-serving. You're going to an e-commerce platform. You're doing your own, building your own solutions and pricing for yourself. And I think of one example. One of our customers at Pros, who's one of the largest glass manufacturers, and it's I mean, to me, a little bit shocking to see that they went from 20% of their sales and pricing engagements were happening in an e-commerce situation to today they're at almost 80% of those transactions happen in an e-commerce environment. So we've moved forward, honestly, at the speed of light. There's been an inflection point over the past year and a half or so, and it was already happening. But I think COVID has really precipitated that transformation into this era of self-service, lower touch, much faster response times, and moving away from tools like Excel, which I think really were very much prevalent about a year ago, and I think are starting to become a little bit secondary to better pricing solutions. The future, to me, I think is where we fully integrate pricing into the customer relationship, and that to me is really exciting. And I think it comes again across multiple dimensions. One of which is machine learning and AI. So we're really bringing in the full force of the information that we have available at our fingertips. So think of things like, as I was mentioning, what are market conditions? We're seeing prices across the board skyrocket for a lot of feedstock and building materials, et cetera. So how does that affect my product? How do I take that into consideration into real time for the deals that I'm creating? That's one dimension. But also supply side, what do I have in stock? Today, that's generally not taken into consideration when coming up with price recommendations. Price recommendations usually take into account, some measure of market conditions, but not necessarily what's happening on my operations side of the house. So that's another piece that I think is going to be really game changing. And I think if I had to put in a third one, which is really critical, is this notion of omni-channel. And this isn't new, right? We hear about omni-channel all the time. People want to be cohesive across the different channels that they're selling in. But I don't know that I've seen it happen, right? We're on the path towards this omni-channel offering. But today, if you come in through one channel, you might get a price recommendation that's different from that of another channel. And the price rationalization across your channels isn't necessarily consistent. And so you need to, this is something that I see is going to evolve in the future and will make pricing even more powerful. There are a few people that I feel like have had a very important impact on my career, and some of them I think would be great to bring on board. So, one thing I didn't mention when you asked me about a brief intro is my time at Pros has actually been in two stints. So I spent 7 years at Pros, and then I left Pros and I joined the Boston Consulting Group, where I spent 3 years working there, and then I came back to Pros about 6 months ago. So it's been interspersed. My experience with BCG was a fantastic one. And so I would strongly advocate bringing in some of my colleagues from BCG, but one in particular who goes by JMI, who's French like me and works out of the San Francisco office, has done a tremendous amount of pricing across multiple industries and has a wealth of really incredible stories to tell that I think would be really exciting for the audience. I mean, I'd bring him on and ask him about his experience in pricing across different industries. And yeah, he's got some fantastic stories, lots of experience on the topic. And so I think he'd be a great addition to your guest list. Another person that I bring on is a close friend of mine whose name is Stéphane Bratu, who's also French. Here I am mentioning only French people. But he's the VP of pricing currently at DigiKey, and he's had a tremendous amount of experience in semiconductor pricing, and so in distribution of semiconductors. And he's actually gone through those pricing transformations at multiple companies. And he's worked at Zilliant, one of our competitors at Pros, but also taught pricing in an academic at UT Austin academic situation, and implemented pricing transformations at multiple companies. And so I think having his perspective on those pricing transformations could also be really interesting. And then the last person I'll mention is Martin Simonchik, who's currently at Pros. He's the Chief Customer Officer. He's also got a lot of experience with different companies, different situations. He's invested, he was an investor for part of his career in different companies, and also led those pricing transformations from that perspective. Like me, he was at Pros and he came back to Pros, so we have a similar experience from that perspective. But I think hearing his thoughts on how pricing has helped him transform the companies that he's been a part of could also be really interesting. So here's 3 names. Happy to think about some more in the future if you'd like. But they've actually had a wealth of experience that I would love to hear about in a podcast setting as well. Well, email. I mean, if we are sharing emails here, I'm happy to share my contact info here. Email, LinkedIn. I'm not going to leave my phone number on the podcast because I prefer not to. But my email definitely, and I think maybe you could just post it in the description of the podcast rather than have me try to spell it out here and make a poor job of it.